Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters throughout the globe. It's hard to comprehend the mess Britain got into in 2022. 3 prime ministers, 5 chancellors, the Bank of England forced to intervene in the markets, not to mention Boris Johnson's COVID party shenanigans. Now Rishi Sunak has lasted more than twice the amount of time Liz Truss was in government. We thought it might be time to take stock. What chance has he of restoring some political stability? And just where's Britain and this government headed next? Jill Rutter is an independent policy analyst, a former UK civil servant, and previously was programme director for the Institute of Government. Hello and welcome, Jill.
Hello, Nicholas.
Thank you very much indeed. You've got a marvellous jumper on. I'm very jealous of that.
This is a parliamentary Christmas jumper that an MP sent me as a present because I told him I didn't turn my heating on very much because of a conversation we had when he was a minister I was working with. So anyway.
It sounds like someone's trying to win favour. That sounds very dubious.
It's quite dodgy, but it's very unusual for MPs to be given gifts rather than the other way around. But anyway.
Yeah, it's true. So let's just sort of jump in there. Back September of last year, what a month. Do you have any conclusions about that period now that have changed? In we're talking about 5-6 months on now. What are your views?
What are my views? I think actually it's sort of pretty. I don't think there's been a great revisionism. You might disagree about what went wrong with Liz Truss's government. She's obviously written this rather long explanation of where things went wrong and found a lot of people to blame. That provoked William Hague, former Conservative leader, to write a rather excoriating column in the Times where he said both of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss that if you basically manage to throw away quite a substantial majority, you're in office, maybe the person you should be blaming is not everybody else, but you should be looking in the mirror and deciding you're at fault. I think what was interesting about the Liz Truss government was how did they get themselves into this position? If you go back to the Conservative leadership election, one of the problems for Liz Truss was clearly she was never the first choice of the MPs as far as we could see. They never put it to a final vote, but Rishi Sunak, who's now Prime Minister, led it every round with the MPs. And I was talking to an MP friend of mine on Monday, and I was asking why he'd supported the candidates he had through the leadership election. He said, because I just wanted to do anything to stop Liz Truss being leader because she's bonkers. And that's British for nuts, whatever you want. Anyway, and I think that was the view of quite a lot of MPs. But Liz Truss was clearly very appealing to the Conservative membership. It was always clear if she got into the last 2 that she was going to win with the Conservative membership because she appealed to their desire to cut taxes. I think what nobody quite realised was that she would go for broke so quickly and that she would do that on top of this massive energy package. The really interesting thing about her energy package was that it was barely reported at the time. If you remember, it was when Liz Truss was unveiling her big energy package that the news started to filter through that the Queen was very ill. We had those scenes in Parliament of people creeping in and giving messages as Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was trying to respond to Liz Truss. So the news that day was not focusing on how many billions the government had just committed to spend on their energy package. We basically went into news blackout about that effectively for 2 weeks. And instead, the entire concentration was on the death of the Queen. In that sort of very peculiar British way, that became a complete preoccupation. And that meant, I think, that the government really hadn't had time to digest the reaction to the scale of that package, which they hadn't promised during the leadership election, because Liz Truss, during the leadership election, had been quite dismissive of Rishi Sunak giving handouts to help people with their energy bills. And I don't think the government quite took enough stock of the fact that it had massively changed the fiscal position before they then went for their really unnecessary mini budget on the 23rd of September. There's absolutely no real need to do that budget then. They could have waited for much more conventional timing, but they compounded their folly by making clear that they were going to go head to head with what they deemed to be Treasury orthodoxy.
I just want to stop there. You're in a position to judge to some degree here because you have a background as a civil servant and you used to work in the Treasury.
I used to work in the Treasury. I did indeed work in the Treasury. So the government made it very clear that it had no time for Treasury orthodoxy. Its first act, when Liz Truss took it over, that evening, they dismissed the permanent secretary at the Treasury. Now, in the US, that's absolutely par for the course. You expect the senior officials to all bite the dust the moment there's a change of administration. In Australia, it's become, I think, quite well known that quite a lot of the secretaries of government departments change when there's a change of government. But in the UK, we tend not to do that straight away. And that was a bit of a sort of declaration of war on the Treasury. Tom Scholar, who'd been the permanent secretary for a long time, had been the person who saw the UK, one of the lead officials on the recovery from the global financial crisis of 2008-9, was dismissed instantly, told to pack his bags and leave the building. So we didn't have that senior official there. That obviously had some impact on the people who were used to working with Tom. He was very well liked, very highly respected in the Treasury. The government then said that although they were doing this big fiscal package, they weren't going to ask the UK's independent fiscal forecasters for an assessment of the impact of that package. I think, open brackets, because they knew it'd be pretty damning, close brackets. So they didn't want to ask, a sort of bit of don't ask and they won't be able to tell you. And they assumed, I think, that without that, the markets would be convinced by their theory that they had a viable package where their tax cuts were going to re-stimulate the UK economy, change the trajectory of a low growth, low productivity economy. Low productivity has beset the British economy. Low growth has beset the British economy since the financial crisis. We've had a terrible growth record, terrible productivity record since then, that they would be able to convince the markets. But I think what they failed to realize, that what they dismissed as tedious Treasury orthodoxy was in fact a sort of rather better understanding of the potential market reaction than they themselves had. And it was, the reaction of the markets.
Yeah. I mean, Jill, it was a catastrophic failure, obviously, in terms of the policy in itself. But for the Conservative Party too, if you trace it back to 2016, 5 prime ministers. No prime minister seems to have lasted more than Boris Johnson was the longest lasting, perhaps. But in terms of what their purpose is, what they're trying to deliver for the electorate, and their ability to achieve it, it does seem hazy, to say the least. And as we said in the introduction, the result has been very, very shaky. Can you see a line going back through all of this? I mean, how do you sort of? Surely there should be a clearer purpose to all of this.
Well, this is a bit of a sort of Henry VIII sort of, divorced, beheaded, died. This is our multiply married former monarch. If you go through the reasons for the demise of all these Conservative prime ministers. First of all, David Cameron resigned on the morning after the referendum. He'd campaigned to remain, said that he wouldn't resign, but then decided that, I think in his own words, he wasn't the captain to steer the next course as the UK had to negotiate exit. He didn't think he was the right person to do that. So he went. There was then this bizarre leadership contest where everybody expected Boris Johnson, I think, to win. And or at least, the very least, someone who had campaigned for leave, because they, after all, were the inheritors of this. They had, if you like, delivered this result so that one of them should steer it through. But after the sort of, move of Michael Gove, who'd worked with Boris Johnson on the Leave campaign. After Michael Gove withdrew his support from Boris Johnson withdrew his candidacy. Gove stood instead, was eliminated because people regarded him as a backstabber. So we ended up with this bizarre contest, which was supposed to be Theresa May, long-serving Home Secretary, seen as solid and reliable, but had campaigned for Remain, even in quite a lukewarm way, versus the relative unknown Andrea Leadsom, who blew herself up in an unfortunate interview. So you got Theresa May becoming Prime Minister in July rather than September.
But I think you perhaps don't want to rehearse all the minutiae because there's too much of it. But here, if we go back to 2016, there was a clear vote, and Boris Johnson, when he came into government, his stance was let's get Brexit done. Arguably, Britain has left the European Union, yet the Conservative Party seems to have no clearer sense of purpose than it did those few years ago.
I think that's interesting. I mean, I think that Theresa May's premiership was torpedoed by the fact that she couldn't get agreement in her party about what Brexit meant. So she was an inheritor of the failing that. The appeal of Boris Johnson, there were a lot of people in the Conservative Party who'd been in the anyone but Boris camp. But then when they saw the results of the European elections, when the Conservatives sunk to 9% in the European elections in the summer of 2019, thought they faced electoral oblivion unless they went to Boris Johnson, who they thought was the only person who could turn it round with his mantra of getting Brexit done. Boris Johnson did enough in the withdrawal agreement, though we're still living with the consequence in terms of Northern Ireland Protocol, to get the UK out of the EU and to win that majority and that get Brexit done promise. He did have something of an agenda with his sort of agenda around levelling up. That message managed along with the get Brexit done message to bring him that sort of slightly bizarre coalition of all those former Labour seats in the north. His premiership, you could then say, was completely instantly derailed by having to deal with the pandemic, which preoccupied that. And he was ultimately brought down by his low standards of personal behaviour and integrity, which finally his cabinet revolted against, sort of being forced to go out on the airwaves and constantly lie for him, which I think was his personal undoing. It's why I think Prime Minister is brought down by rather different things. I think he did achieve a degree of consensus within the Conservative Party over Brexit, which I think the failure to torpedo Theresa May. Liz Truss was seen, despite being a Remainer, was seen as a big Brexit inheritor, managed to get that part of the party beside on a sort of agenda of now we've got to go out and realise all these big opportunities from Brexit and return to our Conservative roots as big tax cutters. She terrified the markets, imploded, and her colleagues thought we can't put up with any of this and it's better to get rid of her quickly than to give her sort of any longer in office. So she was brought down, even though technically she was protected for a year by the rules of the 1922 committee, Conservative backbenchers, they just withdrew their support. Rishi Sunak now has inherited what has fundamentally become quite an ungovernable, rebellious party. And I think that's one of the problems, discerning what's Rishi Sunak really about. His first task, at which he's relatively succeeded, was to be not Liz Truss and her chancellor. And he and Jeremy Hunt, who'd been installed by Liz Truss when she sacked her chancellor, finance minister, in a desperate attempt to stay in office, have succeeded in their first task, which was to remove what I think Paul Krugman termed the moron premium on UK government borrowing. But in terms of doing anything more positive, he set out five priorities, some of which are absolute gimmies, where he only has to wait for things to happen, like inflation to go down, because arithmetically, unless something mad happens to energy prices, that will happen. Others are things that he thinks he needs to see off potential other political threats, like dealing with illegal immigration across the channel. But time and time again, the thing so far that's characterized the Sunak premiership is that he has changed course when faced with a potential rebellion by his party. So he proposes something on planning reform. One faction in his party makes clear that they won't vote for it, so he backs down. So it's really unclear to discern at the moment what Rishi Sunak is really for, as opposed to what he's not, which is Liz Truss.
I'd love people to start putting questions down. Do just put tap away in the Q&A box. We've got a range of people watching. We've got people in Australia and the States, and a lot of Brits watching too. I've probably got the Brits maybe in the majority actually, but we've got a good balance of people there. So do put your questions in early, please. Here we are. The one of the key points from the backbenchers is that Brexit, the opportunities from Brexit have not been delivered yet. I mean, here we are all this time after the referendum. Conservatives have been in government all this time, and Brexit has not been fully implemented. You've got a package of legislation put forward by Jacob Rees-Mogg that puts an expiry, a sort of timer on all EU regulations currently in British law. That seems to be a pretty bold bit of legislation, which is going to go through Parliament at the moment. Is that right? Has Brexit not been delivered? Is there what is the demand from the backbenchers? What do you think is also sort of realistic?
Well, there's a real problem of what was Brexit for? And one of the geniuses of the Leave campaign, of course, was to not make that clear, because the coalition that was assembled together was a coalition of people who wanted, for example, to take control of our borders and reduce migration. We certainly have nominally control of our borders. Net migration was at record levels, partly for pandemic-induced reasons, but also because we've substituted EU migration, which has fallen dramatically, net migration with the EU, with non-EU migration, particularly into sectors like the health service and into ICT, and there are record numbers of foreign students here.
It essentially shows you the demand, isn't it? That there's a demand.
Yeah, so there's a lot of demand. So, but I mean, migration as an issue has fallen in salience dramatically. So if you voted for Brexit primarily because you were worried about free movement of labour from the EU, then you might say, well, that's been delivered. If you're worried about constitutional positions, our rights to make our own laws and our removal from the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and there are some constitutional Brexiters for whom those are the big issues, then you could be relatively happy. You won't like what's going on in Northern Ireland still, but subject to that. Great Britain has been removed from those jurisdictions. So that's England, Scotland and Wales. So you could be relatively happy about that. If you were a Brexiter who thought Brexit was going to give the UK economy a massive boost and you could launch on a big fiesta of deregulation and remove all these pesky EU laws, then you are much less happy. And you could regard Jacob Rees-Mogg's legislation, what's called the Retained EU Law Revocation and Reform Bill, as a sort of ultimatum, not just to bureaucrats in Whitehall, though if you take that view, you'll think that a lot of bureaucrats in Whitehall are on a mission to frustrate Brexit, but also to all your fellow ministers who don't see repealing obscure EU laws as a top priority because they've got other things to do. It's a bit of an ultimatum to them that they have to get on with it now. And that's why we have this.
I mean, just to state the obvious, it's about sovereignty. It's not having foreign EU laws. I mean, it's just purging the whole lot. So we've got everything as British.
No, but that's not, I mean, well, there's a nominal thing, which is that we end a category called retained EU law and relabel it assimilated UK law. So that gives you a constitutional move. What we have absolutely no idea at the moment is whether substantively ministers are going to change lots of EU laws or not, because under the bill, they could just restate every bit of EU law as UK law, and that would meet the terms of the bill. It gives them the powers to do that. Most of business would much prefer they did that than that they make loads and loads of changes, particularly rushed changes on which there will be minimal consultation. One of the big worries is because the deadline, which is originally in Jacob Rees-Mogg's original legislation, 2026, not 2023, but one of the worries about the rush deadline is that simply that the government keeps on changing its estimate of the number of laws that are within scope. They had a 50% increase after they asked the National Archive to do a check. So it went up from 2,400 laws in scope to 3,800. And I think they've just done another revision to their dashboard, and we've added another 500 or something like that. So there's a real risk of accidents, legal uncertainty, and generally making the UK, at least until we're through this phase, quite an unattractive investment prospect, because you really don't know what regulatory regime you're investing into. Lots of other worries that the government will use it to water down environmental legislation, employee rights and things like that. The government says it won't do that, but they won't have very much time, because the bill at the moment is just being considered by the House of Lords. So even with this 2023 deadline looming, end of 2023, it's not on the statute book yet. So there's a massive amount of work to be done to try to get this right. So it strikes most people as a sort of rather mad use of time. And I think this is a view probably shared by Rishi Sunak, who, when he was Chancellor, managed to get an exemption for the sort of areas under his responsibility from the provisions, and also from Jeremy Hunt, now the Chancellor, who basically said he wanted to look at targeted reform in 5 areas, which seems a much more sensible way of going about this.
What you've pointed to is a sort of tremendous sense of uncertainty, which is, and that's concerning regulatory reform. But if one was to stand back and look at the fallout, the political fallout of the last year, but also I think a sort of deliberate attempt politically by the government to criticise the civil servants and also institutions. One could go back to the dissolution of Parliament back when Boris Johnson first came into office. If from your position, when you're looking at the instituted government, you're concerned about how well governed is Britain, have the last few years been, I'm in a way I'm asking you to confirm my own prejudice in a way, but what's the damage that's been done to British institutions?
I think there's been a lot of damage done. I mean, it's the Institute for Government, where actually I'm still a senior fellow, has a strapline of making UK government more effective, and it was founded in 2009. And if anyone says, well, you were founded in 2009, 14 years on, is the UK government more effective? You have to say, no, the UK government looks like in a massive mess at the moment. A lot because of the lack of any consistent direction. The questions we were asking, Nicholas, about, do we know what the government's trying to do? It's been a bit of a sort of zigzag path with ministers changing very rapidly, prime ministers changing, no obvious clear direction on a whole range of subjects, a lot of turnover in the civil service, a lot of forced exits of top civil servants in conflict with ministers, some ministers who clearly appear to be very, very difficult to work for. So we've had lots and lots of very well publicised conflicts. We have ministers who have, this is not uniform across ministers, but quite a few ministers who demonise the civil service, say they're getting in the way of their agenda, stuck in the mud. Another critique of the civil service is that even though the government doesn't give civil servants enough desk space, for them all to be in the office at once, is demonising working from home and saying lazy civil servants are all not coming into the office and not doing much work, and we could just get rid of them all. One of the things that is very noticeable, though, was that David Cameron and George Osborne and the coalition government had a clear policy of reducing numbers in the civil service, and they did that really quite successfully to 2016. But then the combination of Brexit and COVID have meant that the numbers have soared upwards in order to service getting out of the EU and dealing with the pandemic. The minister's now trying to get those numbers back again. So Whitehall civil service has become much bigger. It's had to take on a lot of functions that were previously performed by the EU. So we have a government that really doesn't like the civil service, but which has had to increase its size. But the cabinet secretary, a guy called Simon Case, said in evidence to the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Select Committee in Parliament in the summer that this was a government, he was talking about Boris Johnson's government because it's before Boris Johnson went. It was a government that liked to test the boundaries. And you might say that they've been testing some of the boundaries to near destruction, to sort of put pressure on institutions. We've had Theresa May railing against Parliament and Boris Johnson railing against Parliament, standing in the way of Brexit. We've had ministers railing against the courts, the Supreme Court decision overturning the government's prorogation. We've had ministers doing what ministers are not supposed to do, which is clearly doing things which potentially embarrass the Crown. That's supposed to be one of the no-go areas in our constitutional safeguards, that ministers don't do things that do that. We've had ministers breaking rules. The Prime Minister himself has now had 2 fixed penalty notices, but we had, what really brought down Boris Johnson was his repeated denials about parties in Downing Street, when it's pretty clear there were parties in Downing Street. The investigation into whether he misled Parliament is still ongoing by the Privileges Committee. So there's a whole range of, all the sort of things that we think are protectors and checks in our constitution. Obviously, unlike Australia, unlike the US, we don't have a written, formally codified constitution, but all those things that we have as safeguards to make the system work, we've had people pressing at them to see how far they can do them, have repeated rows about ministers failing to observe proprieties on things like procurement during the pandemic, some of which can be explained by the emergency. Lots of rows. And last week, the big row was over the appointment of the chairman of the BBC, who had not declared to select committee when he was being interviewed for the job. His not a confirmation hearing, but his pre-appointment hearing, as we call them, hadn't admitted that he was simultaneously helping facilitate a loan to bail Boris Johnson out of his financial problems.
Jill, when's the next election? When does the next election have to be held by here?
So the last possible date, it's back in Prime Minister's discretion again, because we lost the Fixed Term Parliament Act. So the last possible date is January 2025, mid-January 2025, because that would mean a campaign over Christmas. I think most people think it would probably be before that, though governments that look like they're losing do tend to hang on to the last minute. So
another 2 years. Another 2 years. So this leads me on to, after all this, when you've dispelled it out in detail, after all this sort of chaos, if you like, and sort of denigration of institutions, after COVID, do you get a sense of a move away from populism, different demands from a society that's in greater need has different needs?
Well, I think, I'm not sure whether I would interest in your views on this. I think we now have a different set of issues that have really come to the fore, because at the moment, the sort of overwhelming preoccupation is with the cost of living, the impact of the energy crisis on bills and people's standard of living. The UK is beset with series of strikes by public sector workers. The government effectively is asking public sector workers to take very big real wage cuts. There are real wage cuts in the private sector as well, but the ones that the government is trying to impose in the public sector are much, much bigger. So the government's really, really struggling with that. Now, is that sort of populist? People asking for wage demands. I mean, the time that it reminds most people of in the UK is the late 1970s, when we had a lot of industrial unrest, the winter of discontent, and all of that, because basically strikes had rather ceased to be a thing that we worried very much about. They were, very obscure. The numbers of strike days were very low. So I think, the economy is back with a vengeance as the issue, as a big issue. The government does do bits to try and still play to populist urges. We, have our own sort of, compared to the US, rather mild version of culture wars being launched. We have, stirring rhetoric from the Home Secretary about the need to deal with illegal migrants coming across the channels, even though numbers are much higher than they were, but they're not absolutely huge. The UK doesn't take that many refugees. So there's some sort of populist inflections there. But I think one of the things that really is quite interesting is that it does appear that popular views of Brexit are turning to some extent. That there's sort of rhetoric about it will all be great. There does seem to be a section of the public that was maybe pro-Brexit, maybe relatively neutral, which does now seem to be prepared to say that Brexit was a bad idea. And you do see increasing numbers who are saying that actually maybe the UK should rejoin the EU. So that sort of bit.
But it's noticeable at the same time, the Labour Party, that where there was an election tomorrow would seem highly likely to win an election. There are lots of nuances to that too, but they avoid making comments about Brexit like the plague. And it would seem to me that, as you say, the cost of living being the primary concern, and this addresses, I guess, if the government is to have any success and to try and deliver on what it's in those areas that delivered it such a big majority in 2019, it's this policy of so-called levelling up. In other words, delivering wealth to areas of Britain that have underperformed or are far worse off.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So levelling up was the big Boris Johnson slogan. And in particular, he was saying that he would sort of, boost areas that had been neglected, left behind, particularly in the north, but also sort of more coastal areas and things like that. Boris Johnson then, when he finally gave a speech on levelling up, said that he was going to do that, but that other places wouldn't suffer at all. And one thing about Boris Johnson was he was incredibly spendthrift. Boris Johnson was not a fiscal conservative of any sort. He really believed in spending money. See from his own financial problems that he's practiced what he preached at home as well. But he liked spending other people's money and was perfectly prepared to splash the cash on that. The steam has gone out of that agenda to an extent, I think. It's not nearly so high up the Rishi Sunak version. Liz Truss said she would level up, but in a conservative way, which meant doing it more through tax breaks than through public spending. Rishi Sunak's sort of big idea, and this is really the only big idea he's ever been identified with, is free ports. And he has announced a tranche of free ports around the country, which are areas with sort of lower taxes, some tax exemptions and some regulatory leeway. But we have yet to see whether they actually really do anything. Most of the economic evidence always suggests that free ports' main effect is to divert activity rather than to increase activity. But it'd be very interesting to see whether we manage to create free ports that buck that trend and that they only really work in areas which have very high tariffs, which we don't. So So jury yet out on his big idea. But it's really difficult because the government is having to spend lots and lots of money on things, and so doesn't have huge amounts of money to redistribute towards falling behind areas. It is trying to give away a few more powers, it appears, so more devolution to some of those areas. So we'll see whether that makes that much of a difference with some of those devolution deals. But it was quite interesting. I also work at King's College London at a place called UK and a Changing Europe, and they did some focus groups with people about what levelling up meant to them and what they would like as levelling up in their areas. And when we did these focus groups, the number one issue that people wanted in terms of levelling up was a better local health service. And the number two issue was a reduction in crime and antisocial behaviour. And neither of those are really what the government means by levelling up. The government has this sort of economic agenda about closing the productivity gap between London, which effectively London, the southeast, which effectively cross-subsidise the rest of the economy. That, the perception is the UK could be a much richer place if the rest of the country had anything like the same productivity as London, the southeast, and that would be the big economic gain from levelling up. But actually, for people who live in areas, it seems that their top priorities are more public spending on core public services. And that's something that's very difficult to do in the financial climate when the government's having to write giant checks for energy support, potentially give out much bigger pay increases in public services. And the NHS is facing its worst ever backlogs at the moment. The service, perceived by most people to be in something of a meltdown.
Just to provide a recap, we're sort of giving an overview of where Britain's heading, notably since Liz Truss's catastrophic fall from grace last year, and a sort of an assessment of where Britain has been heading since Brexit. I guess the other sort of key uncertainty about Britain is the State of the Union. We were discussing this earlier. Probably the most effective and successful politician, apart from possibly Nigel Farage, over the last decade has been Nicola Sturgeon. She's just resigned. Is the union any safer than it was, a few weeks ago? What's the uncertainty about the state of the United Kingdom itself?
Well, it's quite interesting how Nicola Sturgeon's decision to stand down is going to play out. One of the first things is that while it was absolutely clear when Alex Salmond, the previous SNP First Minister, stood down after the failure to win the 2014 independence referendum, it was an absolute no-brainer that Nicola Sturgeon was going to take over from him. She was the obvious groomed heir apparent. There is not an obvious groomed heir apparent in the SNP. It's a long time. I think it's since the SNP hasn't had a contested leadership election since 2004. So it'll be very interesting to see where that goes with a much bigger SNP membership. And it'll be very interesting to see how much the route to independence plays in that leadership election, because there are quite big debates within the SNP about how to best achieve independence in the face of an intransigent UK government. Remember, the UK government, unlike David Cameron, back in 2011, David Cameron accepted that an SNP majority at Holyrood meant that he should concede that the Scots could hold an independence referendum. The successive UK governments since then have said no, even when the Scots SNP's done incredibly well in Westminster elections and can point to a majority in Holyrood, that's the Scottish Parliament, for independence. So, and the Supreme Court has just confirmed that they can't legislate themselves to hold an independence referendum. So we have that sort of standoff going on. So I think it'd be a very interesting debate on what's the route. Do they have anyone who's as charismatic and as classy a politician yet as Nicola Sturgeon? I think clearly not. So whoever it is will have to take a bit of time to establish themselves in the way that Nicola Sturgeon was part of the furniture. But conversely, one of the things people have been saying about Nicola Sturgeon is even despite the really propitious circumstances she had, Boris Johnson absolutely detested in Scotland, Brexit absolutely detested by a large number of Scots. Scotland, remember, voted sort of 60+% for Remain. Despite all that, there were times when support for independence appeared to be heading above 55% into the sort of 55 to 60%, but actually then it sort of ticks back down again. And, it's not given the SNP, frankly, a firm enough basis on which to risk another referendum, I don't think, because while they can argue that loads of things have changed since 2014, if they had another referendum and failed to win a second time, then I do think that would sort of take the air quite decisively out of the SNP.
And indeed, there seems to be a division within her own party about that, possibly with that fear in mind.
I think that's right. I mean, her tactic was that they would treat the next general election as a quasi-referendum, but she was setting a sort of bar. It appeared to be that she was setting a bar that 50% of Scottish voters had to vote for the SNP or other parties supporting independence for that to be valid. And I think a lot of people thought that was a very unwise tactic, because lots of people might think, well, this is our opportunity to get rid of the Conservatives in Westminster. Maybe we'll elect a Labour MP because we're electing a government in Westminster, and we'd actually quite like to say something that's relevant to the shape of the next government in Westminster. Yeah. And that's the other threat, of course, to the SNP, is that one of their very strong arguments for independence is that England keeps foisting on them these conservative governments that they hate. That will be a much less potent argument if we do elect a Labour government. And one of the things that the last year, Boris Johnson's, fall from grace and Liz Truss then turbocharging is Labour now consistently is scoring massively high levels in the polls. If they stay anywhere near current levels in the polls, sort of question is whether the Conservatives sort of become the third party because they would do so badly. I don't think anyone thinks they really will do that badly, that the polls will go back. But it doesn't now look as though we may be on course for a Labour government. And if the SNP polls less well in Scotland in the elections, that will make the route back to power. Labour used to regard itself as a natural party of government in Scotland, took Scotland for granted a bit too much. You could argue that the fall of the Northern English seats was a continuation of the trend that delivered Scotland completely to the SNP, and Labour virtually disappeared. It's now only got one MP in Scotland. That if they start winning Scottish seats again, the route back to power in Westminster is much, much easier for Labour.
I think it's quite amusing to think back a few years. I think maybe it was the Cameron government, or maybe it was the Theresa May's government came up with a policy called Global Britain. And it was a reshaping of British foreign policy post in a sort of year of Brexit, and taking the opportunities that are out there, seizing these wonderful possible trade agreements, and being able to punch above our weight in the world. And this was going to liberate things. But I think, as our discussion here so far shows, really the concerns, all the political time, all the political energy is being consumed by crises at home. Marty Ryan, good follow-up question to that. Go ahead, Marty.
I'm curious about what the status is of the border issue with Northern Ireland.
So this is actually one area that the previous government was pretty hard line on, particularly David Frost, who's the EU negotiator who sort of got Britain, or struck a deal that some people might think wasn't much of a deal. But he was particularly hard line on, and there was a very bad relationship with the EU. And the DUP were particularly unhappy about the deal that had been struck by the British government. But now there might be, with Rishi Sunak in office, there might be something about to change, Jill.
So, Marty, this is a very, very live issue at the moment. The UK papers are reporting that Rishi Sunak is flying to Belfast tonight to go and talk tomorrow to the Northern Ireland political parties about an agreement that he may or may not, that his officials may or may not have reached with the EU, designed to be a long-term negotiated solution to make the operation of the Northern Ireland Protocol less onerous and more acceptable.
I would just want to state the obvious, Jill, is for perhaps people who don't know so much about it, the peace in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement, was underwritten by joint sovereignty. So both Britain, the United Kingdom, and Ireland were within the European Union. So within that context, you could have trade and people going across the border, and you could have political arrangements which are much more sort of loose, if you like, than with Britain being out of the EU. Now that Britain's out of the EU, there had to be a hard border, where you have to have customs inspections on goods going into the UK or going to the European Union. And that customs and that line was drawn down the RSC, to the outrage of the Democratic Unionist Party, who are loyalists, who are in favour of being members of the UK. So for them, they were suddenly left under EU law when they see themselves as British, and which was an outrage to them. And this is where this has big political tension has been. The DUP refused to take part in government as a result. And the big question for Rishi Sunak is, can he come up with a deal with the EU that will both please the nationalist parties of Northern Ireland and the DUP? Jill, what do you think the solution's going to be?
Well, it looks as though, I mean, from the briefings that we're getting, we haven't seen anything official. It looks as though he's got some really quite significant movement out of the EU on goods going into Northern Ireland that stay in Northern Ireland. Now, you have to look at the sort of fine print and see how far that goes. But they do seem to have finally conceded the principle that there shouldn't be checks on goods that are verifiably staying inside Northern Ireland. So in the first instance, that probably means that if a big supermarket is supplying one of its branches in Northern Ireland, then it's likely that it's going to not then
Marty, does this make sense to you? So for people living in Ireland, Northern Ireland, it's a question, if you're a Protestant, it's about a question of sovereignty. Why on earth should the EU be checking goods coming from mainland Britain coming to Northern Ireland when it's the same country? This is an outrage. This shouldn't be happening at all.
But if you've got that Sunak deal, then goods that are going to Northern Ireland, if this is the right deal, if this is the deal they've done, then what you would say if you were Rishi Sunak would be those goods are just going into Northern Ireland and they're now not going to be checked if they're doing their green lane, red lane deal. So they'll just go through a channel saying stays in Northern Ireland, not checked. We have to see how extensive that is, because the EU is worried that this just becomes a back channel into the single market. Because, of course, the reason why there's a hard border in the Irish Sea at the moment is because everybody agreed from the get-go in the Brexit talks that there mustn't be a reinstatement of a customs and regulatory border within the island of Ireland, which was thought would become a sort of, another flashpoint, particularly for nationalists, and that if you had to put up any infrastructure, border control posts, all these things the EU insists on at their borders, that that would become target.
Essentially, the current setup, the current agreement does favour nationalists. If you believe in United Ireland, that's the agreement you want. It's
basically a deal. I mean, the interesting thing about the deal that Boris Johnson did, and one reason why a lot of people regard Boris Johnson as utterly disreputable, is that the EU made a proposal which Theresa May said no British Prime Minister could ever sign up to, because it effectively hived off Northern Ireland and put it under EU jurisdiction for goods, relatively limited jurisdiction, but it put it under EU jurisdiction. And Theresa May said no British Prime Minister could ever sign up to this. In Parliament, when the EU unveiled it, she did a deal which actually very complicated arrangements, but kept Northern Ireland much more clearly within the UK ambit and applied rules to the UK. The UK would stay in customs area until some other relationship superseded all of this. The Conservative Brexiters and the Democratic Unionists said that was unacceptable because that meant we couldn't have the sort of Brexit freedoms that we wanted and needed. So that's why they torpedoed her deal and her government. And then Boris Johnson, in order to get out of his Brexit hole, basically, essentially went back on promises the DUP.
Yeah. I'm just going to reduce it to make this really simple.
That May had said was unacceptable. Yeah. So
I want to say something, but just make it really plain and simple. Basically, leaving the European Union was a massive constitutional upset for the UK. And the Northern Ireland, the peace in Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement was, EU membership was core to that. And by leaving that, that's been torn to pieces. And it seems very hard to me, if you're a loyalist, if you believe in British sovereignty in Northern Ireland, or if you're a nationalist, there's no easy solution on either way. We're going to be wrapping up soon, but I'm going to bring in a question in from Diane Cook, and then I'll come back to Marty to see if she's got any follow-up. Go on, Diane.
Yeah, I'm listening to all of this, and as someone in the UK paying my taxes for all of this, you leave me wondering, really, what is the purpose of our government? And Jill, do you see that our political superminds could come up with anything to make things better?
What sort of thing have you got in mind, Diane? I'm quite intrigued by.
I just thought if I were listening to that here, I'm thinking, well, actually, I don't have a government that's delivering anything.
I suppose you could say it's keeping the show on the road, but it's not doing very much more. I think the trouble is that the government's been sort of beset by crisis after crisis, some self-inflicted through Brexit and its inability for so long to resolve what Brexit meant, and still trying to do that. And then managing the pandemic. Of course, the government, would point to some very successful aspects of its management of the pandemic, some much less so. Remember, we've got the COVID inquiry about to kick off. And then it's been, dealing with the fallout of the Ukraine war. Government would point to the fact that it's played quite a big role in helping and bolstering Western support for Ukraine. And it's been trying to take some action, albeit a bit belatedly, to help energy consumers. But I think you're right that these look like governments that are very much at the mercy of events, very reactive, but also having to spend an absolutely interminable amount of time on resolving their internal self-inflicted problems rather than being able to focus on wider problems. And that, the churn that we've had in ministers, where we have a different minister in charge for a few months and then someone else, means that any meaningful reform is not really happening. So it's a very frustrating, and very innovating time. And I think if you said, am I getting value for money from my government as a taxpayer, you would be perfectly entitled to say, no, I think I want my money back.
Jill, I used to say when Americans were comparing, Johnson with Trump, that I would say that Trump, Brexit is permanent, Trump is temporary. In other words, the long-term constitutional, institutional damage that's been done here is going to be, it's generational. It's I can't see, the Labour Party doesn't want to talk about rejoining the EU because it's not going to be possible. They're not going to have us back if you're on that side of the camp. And I can't see, beyond the Rishi Sunak recovering in terms of the economy, I can't see them coming up with a coherent political strategy despite their enormous political majority, the enormous majority in Parliament. Is that unfair?
I don't think it's desperately unfair. I don't think rejoining the EU is on the cards. I don't think the EU would want to contemplate devoting the time and effort to renegotiating access for the UK until it was absolutely clear that the Conservative Party was now in favour of continued membership. There's no point doing it when there's no settled consensus in the UK. There's no point even if you could instantly join under a Keir Starmer government, if you knew that the next Conservative government was going to be campaigning to leave again, why on earth, if you were the EU, would you go through that agony? It was an agony for us doing the Brexit negotiations, also an agony for the EU. And when you talk to anyone in the EU, they now say relations with the UK is about number 12 on our priority list. We've got loads of other things that we need to do, we need to get on with. And moreover, the EU in our absence is sort of evolving in ways that it probably wouldn't have been if we'd still been there, and actually will probably make it even less comfortable for the UK to be a member of, if you look at things like, much more sort of collective action, borrowing, all those things that the UK used to always act as a dampener on. You could argue that actually the EU should recognise that it's benefited from the UK's absence and be interested in striking an interesting and different arrangement. I think there is a question mark about whether there are incentives on both sides to think more positively about where do they want the sort of long-run relationship to be. And once you've got over the sort of trauma of the initial divorce, do you actually agree? Well, actually, there are quite a lot of areas. There have been stories in the papers that Rishi Sunak has asked officials to investigate the possibilities of other areas of cooperation with the EU and deepening and improving the relationship. And certainly if he manages to resolve the Northern Ireland Protocol issue, that will take a lot of tension out of the EU relationship. And the first thing it would do is reduce the risk of any significant further deterioration, which is definitely on the cards, and definitely was on the cards with Boris Johnson and David Frost being very belligerent towards that. So I think, quite a lot of people talk about things like security cooperation, where the EU wanted more formal security cooperation. Frost Johnson didn't want to do it. They might very well do that. There are some tweaks you can do to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, comes up for review in 2025. It's the big UK trade deal with the EU. Better arrangements on things like mobility, which the EU offered and we said no to. So you can see some sort of marginal improvements, but nothing earth-shattering coming through on that. But actually, I was talking today to someone from the Irish Embassy who said that just the tone of the relationship has already improved quite significantly to the one that sort of,
what we haven't spoken about at all is the monarchy. Now, perhaps should have put this question when we're talking about the Union and Scotland. I was looking at some footage of, I think it was François Mitterrand, not a particularly easygoing politician, who was not going to keep with the Queen waiting. I can't see Prince Charles having that, King Charles III, having that hold over international politicians. And really, I can't see him having quite the same hold over Britain in the Union. Does that matter?
I don't know whether it does matter inordinately, but I think you're right. I mean, the sort of, way in which we could deploy the Queen as a source of massive soft power. Our soft power in that sense has been devalued because people still like, I think, the trappings of coming to a state banquet, Buckingham Palace, and things like that. Some international leaders clearly recognise, King Charles's leadership on environmental issues and things like that. So there's some people who do it, but, would a sort of Xi Jinping or somebody be, dead keen for a state visit to visit King Charles? Not at all clear. Would President Trump be so interested? I think, if he's re-elected, I think not. So I think that is a bit of a diminution. I think it's really interesting. Does that have an effect on the Union? I think on the Union, I mean, the SNP's position, not Nicola Sturgeon's personal position, I think, but SNP's position was always that Scotland would retain the monarchy, be another, I think what's technically termed a realm, like Australia or Canada, which has the Queen, King as head of state. So you didn't lose that if you decided to become independent. Would it make any difference if you knew that the King would be slightly upset if Scotland left? I don't think that was a major factor with many nationalist voters, even when it was Queen Elizabeth. So, but it was quite notable, I think, how much effort Charles put into making sure he was seen in all the, in Belfast, in Cardiff, in Edinburgh, straight after the Queen's death. But what's been even more notable and a huge contrast in Liz Truss described Nicola Sturgeon as an appalling attention seeker, and in her 45 days never apparently had a conversation with Nicola Sturgeon, whereas Rishi Sunak does seem to be investing more time and effort in the union. He went to the British Irish Council, his first Conservative Prime Minister to do so, I think. He went and had dinner with Nicola Sturgeon in Aberdeen and things like that. So he is actually, he's just a sort of, nicer guy. I mean, he just does seem to be
probably a bit more
better
aware
at personal relations
of
and more
risks.
willing to invest in them.
Yeah, indeed. Listen, we have to wrap it up there. I know that Marty Ryan's got another question. Maybe we can come to that in just a second, but our official hour is over. Jill Rutter, thank you very much indeed for your time.
You're welcome.